Hi, I'm Kelsy Green with Advanced Energy. We are a nonprofit engineering consulting firm.
And I'm John Gajda, a power systems professor from North Carolina State University. Today, we're going to chat about transmission connected inverter based resources and the impact they're having on the grid. So, Kelsey, let's start with some basics. I've heard it said that traditional synchronous generators are 90% physics and 10% algorithm, whereas IBRs, inverter based resources, are kind of exactly the opposite, kind of 10% physics and 90% algorithm. Can you expand on what that change has meant for the grid and what advanced energy is doing in this space?
Yeah, sure, John. So, traditional generators we think of like coal and natural gas, they are typically very large and rely heavily on the physics of rotating machinery. Whereas IBR's inverter based resources, things such as solar photovoltaics, battery storage, and wind, they rely heavily on the individual inverter's algorithm. So you can see a big difference between the rotating machinery and then the algorithm of the inverter. So our inverter based resources can also range in size from a small residential rooftop system that might be 5 to 10 kW to a 5 megawatt system that's connected to the distribution grid all the way up to our transmission connected systems that are 100, often 100 plus megawatts. And so you can again see the difference here between our traditional rotating machinery. This is something that transmission operators, utilities are very used to studying, very used to modeling. There's a lot of predictability there. You're adding a lot of complexity in with the inverter based resources. And so we, Advanced Energy, have been working on verifying the quality of inverter based resources that are interconnecting both to distribution and transmission over the past decade, and we're seeing a lot of concerning things.
Okay, so as most in the industry know, today's solar farms are most commonly connected to the transmission system in that third category you mentioned, and they're typically anywhere from 20 megawatts up to 100 plus, like you said. What are some of these concerning things that you're seeing around IBR integration?
Yeah, so there's a lot of real world examples of this in the past years, and we could take the Odessa disturbances in Texas as an example that's commonly referenced. And so NERC summarized findings from these disturbances, and some of the things that they recommended were increasing commissioning and verification processes, especially around the settings and controls of these sites. And so that's what we've been working on at Advanced Energy. And like I said before, we're seeing discrepancies between what the standards, the settings and controls should be and what they actually are. And so that discrepancy really leads to kind of exposure from a grid reliability standpoint.
Okay. So, uh, so good reliability sounds like we're talking about adverse operating conditions and things as bad as potential blackout.
Yeah, that's yes.
So we don't want those, and we have a long history, really, in the North American grid of running a pretty reliable system. So, what can be done to get close to eliminating the chance of that happening, at least due to these IBR interconnections?
Yeah, no, it's a good point because that's what we want to work towards is reducing the likelihood of something like that happening. And so there's really a lot of things that can be done. The first is wide scale adoption of IEEE 2800. This was a standard that was released in 2022 and relates to inverter based resources that are specifically interconnecting to transmission system. And so that's something that we've seen transmission operators adopt either in part or in whole. And we encourage that as IEEE 2800 currently is really the gold standard for those transmission IBR interconnections. Along with the NERC, there's different NERC standards, compliance standards that are currently under development right now. And so we really encourage IEEE 2800, and then we also really encourage third-party verification because the standards are great, but unless somebody's verifying that the site is actually meeting the standards, there's just no guarantee. You could tell someone, "Hey, you need to meet this set of standards," but unless someone's checking behind them, there's no guarantee that that's actually happening in the field. So both adopting 2800 and having some sort of third-party verification for it is really what we're seeing as the best ways to reduce that likelihood of adverse operating conditions and like you said ultimately trying to prevent a major grid disturbance like a blackout.
Okay. So when I think about NERC standards and other technical requirements, they're traditionally pointed to either the generator operator or the transmission operator in the case of interconnections. And really each of those has a compliance standard or standards that they have to follow. This idea of third party verification is kind of new because it's kind of gets right in between in there. And so can you talk a little bit more about the ultimate purpose of having a third party verification entity in the mix?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, really, the purpose of the third party verification is again to ensure the compliance. It's really a quality assurance program. And so, we do this in a number of different ways. It typically starts out with collecting and reviewing site documentation. So, things like a single line diagram, plant controller narrative, um, inverter settings, for example. So we'll gather information like that, and our team will look at the information and see if it's in compliance with the agreed upon standard. And then we'll also do a power plant controller demonstration. And so this actually tests the real world functionality of the site. And then we oftentimes will go on site to gather information like the inverter settings, take pictures of nameplates of equipment. And so again, team will come back, our engineers will analyze all of that information and note any discrepancies between what's actually installed in the field and what it should be. And oftentimes there are a lot of discrepancies that are noted, which is unfortunate, but the good news is they can be fixed. And typically the team will work with the generator owner, the developer to get those items fixed before commercial operation. We also have gone back and looked at existing sites that have been in operation. And so the goal is again to just get the site in compliance. So really our role as a third party verifier is to kind of be a liaison between the utility or the RTO, the transmission operator, and the developer. And so we're making sure that that information that's going back and forth between the parties is accurate, consistent, updated. And so kind of the final step of that is taking the information that's on site, making sure that the models are accurate. So the models are only valuable if they're accurate. And like we talked about before, there's complexity to these inverter based resources. And so we want to make sure that the models represent what's actually in the field. And so we'll take that information, make sure those models are accurate, make sure that the transmission operator has all of the documentation, again, accurate to what's in the field. And so this is really what we do as third party verifier is being that, like I said, liaison between the transmission operator and the generator owner.
So I can see how valuable all of that is, and that's today. But how are you seeing this need change in the future?
Yeah. So, as we know, there's expected load growth. And because of different goals that companies and regions have set across the country, we're going to have more IBRs in the future. All the projections are really high for that. And so, as we have more IBRs, we're more reliant on them. So, something that may just be one or two here or there may not be so concerning from a bulk power system reliability concern will become more concerning. So I think that it's, and we talked about the complexity that these inverter based resources add from a modeling perspective and an operational perspective. And so, again, as we have more of them, we're more reliant on them from a reliability standpoint. We're going to need to increase the compliance and the verification of compliance as we go into the future. So, we really see this working on the standards, increasing the third party verification as a significant need for grid reliability into the foreseeable future.
Okay. So I mentioned ERC standards earlier, and you as well. Some may not know about FERC Order 901 and all of the resulting standards work that is happening. Can you share more about how you see the impacts of these standards and who should be worried about them?
Yeah, so there's a breathtakingly large amount of standards work that's happening right now, something that we're paying close attention to. And so there's things like PRCO 29, there's mod or modeling standards that folks should be paying close attention to. And these are, some of these standards relate specifically to the generator owners and operators, and some of them relate specifically to the transmission operators. And so, all things that we should be paying attention to. The other thing that we're we're looking at is IEEE 2800.2. I mentioned 2800 earlier. 2800.2 is currently under development. And so that's something that we're paying attention to. Generally, as we talked about before, there's going to continue to be evolution of standards. We should expect that. We should want that as we learn more. This is all a part of the process. And so, and these can really impact so as there's more standards development, it really makes us want to pay attention to the compliance of those standards. So collectively, we're all going to need to be both paying attention to the standards and ensuring that we're all in compliance with the standards.
So, in your opinion, what should folks in the industry really focus in on right now?
So I kind of see this in two main buckets. So we've talked a lot about the technical aspects, the standards, the evolution there, and I think that's really important. We got to continue to pay attention to that into the future. But there's a whole other bucket which is more process oriented. So if a transmission operator thinks about where they are right now and their verification of these sites and thinks in the future moving towards something that's a more robust verification, thinking about where that gap is. And a lot of the work that we do, the technical parts are challenging, but the process parts are challenging too. So figuring out how we go from where we are now to a more robust verification process is something that I think is critical to pay attention to, because there's often iterations there. It takes time to do that, and so the work that you do right now will set yourself up well in the future. Again, as there's higher penetrations, there's more of this that we're relying upon. As the complexity increases, we're going to need these standards and verification processes in place in order to ensure that the grid stays reliable into the future.
So, Kelsey, where can people learn more if they're interested in more details about this?
Yeah, they can look on our website and reach out to us. So we're very interested in learning more from others about what they're seeing. Are they seeing similar things to us? Are they seeing different things? And so we welcome any conversations that people want to have in this space and would, yeah, be happy to talk more.